It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome back to another podcast by George. We've got a good one for you today, and as a matter of fact, when I was thinking about doing this interview, it was actually ahead of the coronavirus crisis that's, and rightfully so, dominating America right now. But in some ways, it's kind of related. Let me explain a little bit. Now, if you saw my recent podcast with Stephen W. Schmidt, the Lucan Endowed Professor of Political Science at Iowa State University, I mentioned, and again, I wasn't thinking about this, but it's true. I said farm families in some way might be better able to cope, self-quarantine than other folks. Because, and I gave the example, when I was a kid growing up, on a farm on a dirt road, you didn't go anywhere sometimes, particularly in the winter. I mean, if that dirt road was mud, if it was a bad weather situation, you needed a farm tractor to get out like this. I don't know if you can see this right over my left side here, but an Oliver 88 open cab tractor. You're riding along on something like that in a rainstorm. You're a long way from town. I don't care how far out of town you are. It's something that has to be considered. You kind of learn to cope. But that in itself, that coping mechanism, that ability to handle the circumstance that we're confronted with, is unique somewhat to farm families. And I think that's a good way to segue into the interview today, because we're kind of dealing with a crisis of our own on farms around America that goes back to the 1980s. Awareness was first, to me anyway, heightened and brought about by some of my favorite musicians. Bob Dylan was at Live Aid, and he said it'd be nice if we could provide some of this help that's going to Live Aid to farmers. And so then guys like John Mellencamp and Neil Young, they started Farm Aid, and they brought up some of these issues, and they're still helping with that. And it has to do with not only the wealth and prosperity of farmers, but the mental health of farmers. So let's bring in our guest, and let's get to this. Our guest today is Brandy Janssen. She's a University of Iowa professor. She's director of Iowa's Center for Agricultural Safety and Health. And so that's kind of a long-winded intro, Brandy, to get us to where we're at. But would you agree with most of that there's some similarities between what we're facing today and what was first brought into the forefront of American thinking back in the 80s?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. Given the 80s it was about volatility, right? There were market crashes and we had global market shifts, and we're seeing that again now. And we're also seeing sort of more attention then to stress and mental health on the farm.
And, the circumstance that I described to people, farm life is a great thing. It's very unique in that it's kind of a world unto its own. You can kind of create a circumstance, and people, being people, they can create good circumstances, but they can also create situations that make life very difficult, make coping very hard. Have you encountered that in your research and studies?
Farming it's a unique occupation in that your home space is also your workspace. And so it's hard to blur those lines. When you work in a more traditional job setting, one of the ways people say to cope with stress is to leave work at work and separate your home life. And you can't do that on a farm. I think the issue of potentially isolation in rural communities that you were talking about in your introduction, not being able, feeling like you can't leave at times. It can also be challenging. Farmers might be ready, farm families may be used to that, but it's challenging for anybody to be isolated from other people. And there's a lot of solo and individual work in farming. So that's another concern. So it's just it's complex, and it's a complex job setting and industry, and people are juggling a lot of things, and that can make it really challenging to cope with stresses that occur.
And farming isn't easy. Now, I haven't done it for many, many years, and I'm old school, going back to the day. But you got to understand the technology that's involved with this yet. The mechanical part of this, chemicals. I mean, you got to. I mean, the chemicals that are applied on these farms. I mean, you've got to be at the very least knowledgeable and at the best well educated to be able to do this type of thing. And there's a lot of stress involved in this because people don't like to be powerless, and some of this has been taken out of farmers' hands. You've got these. Tariffs and trade wars, and this is a self-reliant group that kind of likes to be in charge. They like to control what they do, but some of this isn't in their control right now. And again, I'm going back to my own experience back in the day. I saw alcoholism on the farm, profound alcoholism. Some of these problems don't get exposed, and they don't get treated the way that they should because of the isolation on the farm. Have you ever studied, or is there a study that correlates things like substance abuses and alcoholism in the farm community?
That's a good question. I don't think I have a good answer to that. Not that I know of, but I think it's a good question. You're speaking to something we know kind of in the population overall, that if people don't have coping strategies that are maybe healthy, they will rely on others that are maybe less healthy, like alcohol use and substance use. When thinking about, for example, our current, another big topic over the last year and is opioid use, right? And that was certainly a rural phenomenon in many ways, which suggests to me that there are certainly an absence of sort of what I would call better coping skills maybe in rural communities. I don't know if that's specific to the farm community, although the Farm Bureau did do some, now that you're saying that, Farm Bureau did do a survey over the last year indicating that about 75% of the respondents nationally, who were all farmers, indicated that they had direct experience with or knowledge of sort of the current opioid situation. So that tells us that there's something with substance use going on in farm communities. So I think it's an area where we need to know more. But just thinking about the context of it, it would not surprise me if certainly people are using substances to cope with lack of control, isolation, volatility, all those things, climate, et cetera.
Well, there ain't no doubt in my mind. And one other thing, the meth scourge, methamphetamine, out in the rural communities. It's really bad in some places, and people are abusing these substances not because they're healthy and wealthy and well, not because they're happy, not because they're leading a carefree lifestyle, which, we think about farming sometimes as being like that, and it can be, but it is not for everyone. Now, what about the trend lines that we see right now? I mentioned the 80s, and these issues have been around forever. But is this a problem that's increasing? Is it increasing steadily? Does it go up and down with the economic situations that we see? Because we're seeing kind of would you say a little, an upshot in this, a mini crisis right now, or how would you define that?
So it's a good question because it's really hard to have good data. We do know that if we're talking about farm suicides, that they have been higher than the general population consistently for many decades. So it was true in the 80s. That was sort of, as you pointed out, kind of the point at which maybe it became an issue more in the public eye. But suicide rates have remained higher among farmers than the general population since then, and they are still higher than the general population. It's harder to tell if we're seeing, especially in a short amount of time, are we seeing, in the last, say, 3 years, are we seeing a spike or a change? Maybe. We know overall that farm suicides are probably underreported for a couple of reasons. One, sometimes you don't get the occupation right. So if a farmer works off farm as well as farming, then they might be in their death record code, it might be coded as that other occupation. So we miss them in the farm statistics, or farm suicides sometimes look like accidents, a hunting accident, and just a firearm accident of some sort. So we miss the suicide part as well. So we know they're higher than the general population, and they have stayed higher than the general population since the 80s. We know that we're probably undercounting them. And then the question is, are we seeing an actual uptick in rates of suicide, or are we doing a better job of catching things early and identifying new conditions, which we didn't do in the 80s until things were already kind of falling apart? So that's kind of a long-winded answer to say, we know they're high. I don't know at this moment, are we seeing a a spike or an uptick, but we're certainly paying more attention to it.
Well, now this is a little bit my opinion. I mean, this is mostly a news, even-handed treatment, I hope, of the events of the day. But here's what I think. I think it's bad. I think it's going to get worse. I think the coronavirus circumstance is going to exacerbate the situation for everyone, and that's not going to help people out on the farm. But I'll tell you something else, in my opinion, that's going to get to be a real issue that's kicking the ass of farmers nationwide, worldwide, and that's climate change. It's the climate crisis. And you're thinking about people that have owned farms that have been in their family for generations, out in western Iowa, let's say. They're underwater. Some of those places couldn't be tilled this year. They're going to be in real bad circumstances. And now you go back to what I was talking about earlier with, farmers that are kind of the kings and queens of their domain, so to speak. I mean, that's their world. It was created by their parents and grandparents, and they were the stewards of it. And it could be gone. They might have to go to town and get a minimum wage job. Think of the mental anguish that could cause. Think of the impact that has on an individual. And climate crisis, unless we address it, is it's going to get worse, and it could get much worse. Is that a factor?
Yes, and I agree with you. Somebody asked me recently what I thought the biggest public health challenge in Iowa is, and I said it's climate right now. I think particularly given our economic reliance on agriculture and the farmers in Iowa, we have both sides. Farmers are affected by climate change. As you know, the flooding in western Iowa is a perfect example of that. The flood and drought and volatile cycles that we've seen through the years. But agriculture also has a lot of potential to mitigate climate change. We can think about sequestering carbon in soils, and we can think about how we pull some of that carbon out of the air and get it back where it belongs, and we can do that through agriculture. That being said, that's just one more thing sort of for farmers to take into account in their operations. So I think there's sort of a level of stress overall that is a result of climate change, not only because you're responding to those weather events that are completely out of your control, but also then that now you're kind of expected and maybe feel obligated to make major changes in your production practices to address it, which is a big burden to put on anybody. So I think farmers are in a kind of a right in the middle of the climate debate, and it's definitely a factor, and it's something we have to address, or it's only going to get worse.
Well, farmers are under stress. I'll tell you something it just makes me think all the time that's also under stress, and it's related to farmer very closely, much more so than we think. Bees. No bees, no people. I mean, we need to start thinking about that too. I mean, and agricultural practices all come into play. Well, I look at my clock and we're already running out of time. I try to hold these things around 25 minutes, maybe a half hour at the most, and we're already coming up on our time limit, Professor Janssen. What else here in closing? I'd like to give folks the last word. I ask questions and you're kind enough to respond to them in a very thorough and accurate way, but what else would you like to say, or how would you like to close this, the final thoughts that you'd like to impart upon the audience?
Well, I think that I can't help but speaking from this moment when we're all sort of sheltered at home and kind of everybody is feeling higher stress level right now. To me, if there's a bright spot in the mental health issue and stress issue with farmers, it's that people are talking about it in a way that I've not heard before. I grew up in the 80s on a farm, and I remember that context very well. And sort of people knew things were bad, but nobody talked about mental health. Nobody encouraged other people. Maybe you should go talk to somebody. Maybe there should be some better services. Maybe we should rethink how we practice agriculture to improve climate situations or to improve farmers' livelihoods. And I think the fact that we're having those conversations is really positive. And so I hope that continues. I think it's really important that journalists and podcasts and rural advocates are all talking about it. And I think it's important to loop farmers into the conversation and get their perspectives as much as possible. That to me is maybe to try to end on a bit of a hopeful note. I think that's a really good thing. I think the context is going to continue to be challenging economically, from a health standpoint and from a climate standpoint. But we're having the right conversations, and that's a good thing.
Well, you're doing your part. Good on you, and thanks for coming on the show. I certainly appreciate that and all the information that you've shared. And I want to encourage everybody, if you like this podcast, please like it on Facebook and subscribe to it on YouTube and follow along and get every episode. And we hope that you like this one today. Joining us on the Podcast by George Live Line, as we call it, is Professor Brandy Janssen. She's from the University of Iowa, and she's the director of Iowa's Center for Agricultural Safety and Health. But for right now, that's going to wrap it up. That's going to do it. That's another podcast by George.